Welcome to Perspectives Matter, the McQuestion program, where we continue talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of the program is made possible in part by donations from individual viewers, grants, and supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television.
Hello, I'm Amanda Schnetzer, and welcome to Perspectives Matter. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration says that in the last decade, we've seen more extreme weather than any other period on record. The summer of 2023, as we all know, was the warmest ever recorded on Earth. Temperatures in the summer of 2024 are expected to climb even higher. Across the globe, we're witnessing unprecedented heat waves, wildfires, rainfall, flooding, and of course, the increasingly devastating effects on countries, communities, and individuals. To help us better understand this accelerating trend of extreme weather, its connection to climate change, and what to do about it, I'm joined by three distinguished experts. Joni Carswell is the CEO and president of Texan by Nature, a nonprofit that works as an accelerator for conservation and a strategic resource for industry. Dr. Andrew Dessler is a professor of atmospheric sciences at Texas A&M and director of the Texas Center for Climate Studies. He studies the science and the politics of climate change. And Peter Girard is Vice President for Communications at Climate Central, an independent group of scientists and communicators who research and report the facts about climate change and how it affects people's lives. Let's dive in. Peter, I'd like to start with you. Can you level set for us about what is extreme weather? Can you define it for us and talk to us about whether the events we experienced this summer of 2023 are extreme weather?
Of course, there's no sort of set benchmark for extreme weather, but extreme weather events are essentially unusual and damaging events. That includes intense rain, heat, tropical storms, and hurricanes. It includes tornadoes. And as you pointed out, there are connections to wildfires, particularly when you've got heat signals. And in a warming world, just about all of these have clear connections and should clearly be expected to increase as global temperatures rise. As the planet warms, a number of these severe weather events become more likely. None of them is more directly connected than the heat that so many of us felt over the course of the summer of 2023. And that connection people understand really well. One that people don't necessarily connect immediately with climate change is rainfall. So for about every degree of Fahrenheit our atmosphere warms, it can contain about 4% more water vapor, which of course falls as rain. We've had something like 2 degrees of Fahrenheit warming, which means about 4 or 8% rather, more moisture in our atmosphere, and that comes down as rain. And of course, like everything in nature, it doesn't necessarily come down evenly. It tends to come in bunches. So a lot of the flooding we're seeing around the world and around the US, that is directly connected to having a warmer, wetter atmosphere.
That's very interesting. Andrew, maybe I would like to ask you, I'm thinking about the bunches of weather, the pattern of extreme weather in the last decade. Is this something that we should expect to become the norm, or is this part of a cyclical change and we'll get back to something that looks more like historic norms or some kind of historic norm?
Yeah, I think it depends on exactly the time scale you're talking about. If you ask the question, what's 2050 going to be like? The weather we're having last year would not be extraordinary. The temperatures and other things would probably be quite average. But next year might not be as hot as this year. So we're still going to get warm years and cool years, but the trend is towards, weather that today we would consider exceptional. In the future, we're not going to consider exceptional. I always like to tell my students that this is one of the hottest summers we've ever had, but it's going to be one of the coolest summers for the rest of the century. So enjoy it.
I am definitely looking forward to some cooler weather. Joni, let's take this down to our region here in Texas. Talk to us about what the implications have been of this extreme weather we experienced this summer, and then maybe put it in that context of a 30-year pattern and what the new normal, I think is what Andrew's telling us. What does that new normal potentially look like right here in Texas?
Sure. So, gosh, I would move even beyond the summer and talk about the couple of winters we've had too, where we had extreme cold. And in Texas, there are multiple impacts. They're impacting infrastructure, they're impacting economy, and they're impacting human health. So I think it was well publicized, some of the grid problems that we had in Texas when we had extreme cold and we couldn't keep up with the need for heat. We experienced the same during the summer when we can't keep up with cooling down our infrastructure. And then along with a lot of the heat, we've had some pretty significant drought in Texas over the last few years that are putting a strain on our water resources. This is impacting our electric bills at the citizen level. It's impacting our bills for the corporations in Texas, which is pretty significant because Texas actually has the world's 9th largest GDP. So if you're looking at rising costs for the products coming out of Texas, that impacts the globe. And then there's the human health aspect. We've all heard of the SAD, the seasonal affective disorder, and that's something that you typically associate with the Pacific Northwest or somewhere where you don't get a lot of sunlight. But this summer, we were actually seeing people in Texas, the land of eternal sunshine, impacted by SAD. And that was because they could not get outside because of the extreme heat. So while we had all of the sun needed, just these tremendous weather patterns were keeping us indoors. And as far as what that means to the future, I think it means that we really need to focus on restoration of some of our natural ecosystems today, looking at trees that we're planting today that can help cool the ground, looking at revitalizing our waterways so that we are prepared for the population growth that we expect, is really the only way we can look at how to think of these weather patterns as the norm for the future and prepare for us to keep it at the low end of that norm and make sure that we are implementing practices that set us up well to deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to harden our world against all of the possible impacts. That includes extreme heat, it includes extreme precipitation, it includes extreme sea level events like storm surges that come with hurricanes. It includes more variability in rainfall, meaning you'll have periods where it's very dry will be longer, followed by intense rain events. These are things we all see happening now. They're going to get worse. We have to be prepared for all of them.
And you've shared some interesting data with us that looks at these extreme weather trends, both in the context of climate change and in a much longer historical perspective or context of 30,000 years since the Ice Age. Can you talk about the pattern of weather and climate in that much larger context, and what does that tell us?
Right. So when you look at the deep time, go back to the last Ice Age, the important lesson there is that the kinds of warmings we're on track for, something like 6 degrees Fahrenheit of global average warming by 2100. And you talk to people and they say 6 degrees, who cares? Winter's 100 degrees warmer than summer in a lot of places, and daytime can be 50 degrees warmer than night. So 6 degrees doesn't sound like much, but when you look at the global average, what you see is that the last ice age was only about 10 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than we are now. So you think about that. I mean, really think about that. If you cool the climate by 10 degrees Fahrenheit, global average, you end up with an ice age. And we're going to be warming the climate by 6 degrees. That's 60% of an ice age of warming over this century. So, I tell my students, you guys are going to live through this. And, all indications are it's going to be a bad ride. So we need to do something about it and not actually warm ourselves by 6 degrees Fahrenheit, because we still control how much warming we have. I mean, that's something every viewer should understand. We still control what's going to happen this century, not 100%, but we control whether we have 6 degrees of warming or 3 degrees of warming, whether it's going to be really, really bad or just pretty bad.
Peter, I want to ask you, I mean, this is a complex topic. There's a lot to think about personally, as a region, as a country, as a person who's on the globe. And I know that Climate Central, your organization, spends a lot of time and energy investment in how to talk about these challenges with the general public, with the media, with policymakers.
This sounds really simple, but tell the unvarnished truth. And that's been one of our guiding principles as a scientific organization. We've delivered information about particularly what people are experiencing locally, what some of the near-term effects are, and also what some of the solutions that people can support and take part of. And all of it without diving into particular policies or politicians. We try to present information in as clean and direct a context as possible. It doesn't necessarily mean avoiding politics because, as you say, all topics are politicized to some extent. But we found that we've built trust, even with people who identify as conservative audience members, simply by telling them what the facts are and what we know, and also by being clear about what we don't know and what the limitations of the information we can provide are.
But first, to talk about solutions, I want to talk about what's the goal. You need a goal in order to have solutions. And so I think I heard, Andrew, we'll start with you. I think I heard you saying that the goal has to be slowing the pace of warming that is in turn driving these extreme weather patterns. I'll let you respond whether I've got that right. And then I'd love to hear from Joni and then from Peter about how you would articulate the goal, and then we're going to dive into solutions.
Right. Well, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. We need to be doing a lot of different things. We need to be slowing down the warming. We also need to be making our society more resilient to the warming we can't avoid. But as you pointed out, the number one thing we have to do is stop the climate from warming. If the climate is continuously warming, then we'll never be able to deal with it because it'll always be this moving target. So we need to stop the climate warming, and that basically means we need to stop emitting greenhouse gases. So we need to get, you often hear people talk about net zero, meaning that humans are not adding any greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, or if they are adding some, they're removing an equal amount somewhere else so that there's no net additions. And if we do that, then the climate will stop warming. And then we can worry about all the other things, about adjusting to the changing climate, which we're also doing not a great job of right now, but absolutely needs to be done.
Joni, how would you articulate the goal? What's the goal for you and your stakeholders at Texan by Nature?
Sure. Without diving into what the solution is, which is, of course, where I want to go. It is, and Andrew articulated it well, it's controlling what we can control, but it's striking that sustainable balance. What does sustainable mean? It means that we can all thrive long term, right? Whether it's industry, whether it's human, our ecosystems, that goal is to get to where it's not a moving target anymore and that we are actually in balance. And coming from a conservation organization, of course, to me, that means restoring natural ecosystems and getting nature and wildlife and water back to where they need to be versus some of the degraded states that we see today. So that goal would be that balanced, sustainable system for the long term.
Okay, Joni, I'm going to come back to you first on solutions, but I'm going to let Peter share his goals first.
Cool the planet. I mean, it's ultimately what the goal of all of our work is really meant to point toward. And from Climate Central's perspective, it's making sure people understand what is happening, understand the science, and know what the paths forward are.
Got it. Well, so Joni, I promised I was going to come back to you first. Texan by Nature is an accelerator for conservation. That's how you all describe the organization. And you work towards accelerating conservation by working with diverse stakeholders, especially with industry. Can you connect a little bit more the conservation work that you do to the solutions that you implement on your own or in collaboration with some of these other stakeholders?
Sure. So as you mentioned, we accelerate conservation. And we work with 145 plus conservation groups to do that. We build on best practices. We take a data-based approach to looking at conservation efforts that you can measure the impact, not only in terms of acreage or number of trees planted or species, but what is it doing in terms of carbon, in terms of water, in terms of biodiversity that we're now measuring at the climate level. And so in bringing these groups together, we've talked a little bit about the impact of these massive weather swings, whether it's massive participation in storm surges, whether it's the extreme cold, extreme heat. And a lot of the work that we're doing on the ground, I'll use an example of reef building along the Texas coast. Those provide actual protection against storm surges. They reduce the impact, and they are restoring native environment for wildlife and a variety of endangered and species that we're protecting. But more than that, they're also sinking carbon and providing metrics and impact numbers that companies are articulating in their sustainability goals more and more each year. And so if you look at how to bring the amount of funding needed to bear for conservation and to get industry to think about their impact in a broader way, the real solution is bringing industry and conservation together. It's plugging each other's gaps, right? So conservation groups need help with funding, but they also need help with strategy and finance and some of the broader business aspects of expanding and replicating conservation, while industry needs help with achieving the goals that they've set. Many set net zero goals or other goals without actually first understanding their baseline data and understanding what it would take to change their internal practices. So while they're changing their internal practices, they will actually have a need to have a diversified portfolio, so to speak, that includes local conservation efforts. So the more that we can look at things like reef building, reforestation, riparian restoration, wetland creation, and understand the total impact on what we're measuring from a greenhouse gas perspective, from a water perspective, from a biodiversity perspective, that puts us in a new solution space where we're really working together as industry and conservation to do exactly what Andrew and Peter are talking about, to stop the warming, to start to cool the planet. And there are examples of solutions across ecosystems where we can work together to make this happen.
Peter, Joni made some really interesting points, including about the importance of data and measurement in this environment today. Say a little bit about the work that you do at Climate Central and how important data and measurement are in having these kind of balanced conversations that we want to have, or that some of us are just so desperate to have.
It's so critical to presenting the science and doing it in a way that people understand it. And as I said, making people aware of what these local impacts are and what the data look like, visualizing it to make it accessible. These are the things that are really important. And as Joni said, it can be difficult to manage what you can't measure, and people don't relate to it as easily. And so by making these data points, whether that's looking back at trend lines to show us kind of where we are and where we've been, projections for the future, these are incredibly important tools to help people understand what the impacts are, what the dangers are, also what some of the progress that's being made looks like, because there is some.
Let's talk about that in a data-based way. Peter and Andrew, you both shared some interesting data with me about wind and solar in Texas and across the United States, but we dug in a little bit extra special right into what's happening in Texas. Peter, talk a bit about the expansion of wind and solar in the United States, and we've got a couple of slides to look at what that looks like right here in Texas.
You're seeing immense growth in both wind and solar electricity generation for a number of reasons. You'd like to think some of it is a world that's decarbonizing and trying to figure out a way to generate power without producing emissions. It's also good business, and that's part of why you see this growth across the US and across Texas. Princeton just released a study looking at the impact of policies on the near future in terms of how much electricity states can produce or how much capacity they'll have. Texas is on track, at least according to the optimistic analysis that this study produced, to create almost 4 times the amount of electricity that the state is currently generating from wind and solar by 2035, which is practically just around the corner. And even on these year-to-year bases, you're seeing huge gains in Texas in terms of wind and solar. Texas produced something like enough electricity in 2022 to power 12 million homes. That's actually more homes than there are in Texas. And from solar, which is one of the fastest growing sources of electricity generation in Texas, it grew year over year by almost 40%, enough to power another 2 million homes. Imagine that multiplying by 3 or 4 times in a relatively near term, and you have enough power to generate something like 75% of Texas's total electricity needs. So Texas is leading the nation in producing electricity from these renewable sources, from the wind and the sun.
Andrew, tell us, share with us your perspective. What are the opportunities in this data around wind and solar that Peter just shared? What are the remaining challenges? And maybe especially given your work, talk about that in a policy context, whether that's at the national level, state, or local level.
Yeah, so it's useful to ask the question, why is Texas so successful? And there are a couple of reasons. First off, we have a lot of sun and we have some really windy areas. So we have the natural resources. We also have a reasonably free market energy system that allows anybody who's willing to build a power plant to hook into the grid. And since wind and solar are so cheap now, lots of people are building that because it's basically the cheapest energy we have. But it's also important to understand the role of government in this. So one of the reasons why Texas is so successful is that Rick Perry, about 20 years ago, he spearheaded the building of a big transmission line from West Texas to the big cities that are mainly on the eastern half of the state. And without transmission, renewable energy is much harder to penetrate into the market. And so there's a key role for the government in helping us transition by building the big infrastructure. I think the biggest, in fact, that's really the biggest challenge. If we want to get off fossil fuels and rebuild our energy infrastructure for clean, cheap, renewable energy, we have to be able to build big things like transmission lines and things like that. And right now, that's really the challenge. A lot of the tools that were pioneered by environmentalists in the past decades to stop, pipelines they didn't want to come through, those have been co-opted by fossil fuel interests to stop the development of renewable energy. And I think we have a real political problem. And let me just emphasize for your audience that, climate change is not a scientific or technical problem. It's a political problem. And it's these kinds of political battles about, can we build the infrastructure that allows us to stop burning fossil fuels? That's where the battle is. It's not, can we develop technology? Do we understand the science?
Thank you. Let me ask you about some specific policy making that has happened just in the last 2 years. In 2021, President Biden signed the bipartisan infrastructure package that had very specific objectives and goals and a lot of money tied to it, taxpayer dollars, our guests' dollars tied to it, related to infrastructure and with some of our climate and weather challenges in mind. How is that going? What's good about that? What's not working or needs to be improved? I'll start with you, Andrew, and then we can go around.
Yeah, I give President Biden a lot of credit. I think he's done more to solve the climate problem than basically anybody else, maybe on the planet. And there, as I said before, there's a key role for the government in building the big things that private industry is never going to build, like transmission lines. And I think that the policies that have been implemented will really help push forward this transition, which is going to happen by itself, but probably not fast enough for us to avoid really a lot of warming. So with the help of the government, it's going a lot faster.
Joni, how would you respond to how things are going with the bipartisan infrastructure package? And maybe also tack on to that sort of what role, Andrew spoke a lot about the role that government needs to play or may need to play. What's the role for industry as you see it?
Sure. So first on the government funding and some of the packages that are available, one thing that we're starting to deal with is a workforce issue. If we look at the aging infrastructure in our water systems moving forward, and then even our electric grid, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And in some cases, the workforce isn't currently in place to actually distribute the funding and to accurately put some of these projects in place. So long term, it's going to take industry and government and community and citizens coming together to solve some of these issues, our education systems as well. So it's going well. It's exciting that the funding is there, but now it's how do we actually execute? How do we move forward with that funding towards real change? And that's something that we're working with both the industry and the conservation community on through the Texas Water Action Collaborative, is understanding where the gaps in that workforce are and how we move this along. And then in regards to what is the industry role, what is the conservation role, as we're building renewable energy, I think there are lessons to be learned from fossil fuels. They've engaged very heavily in water conservation. They've engaged very heavily in grassland restoration and pollinator habitat restoration. And I would hope that as we build more solar fields and more wind, that's a key part of industry looking to what we've learned from the past and doing the playa restoration we need to recharge the Ogallala Aquifer, doing the pollinator work, et cetera. So there's a role for all of us to continue to play, learning from the past and pushing forward with innovation.
So Peter, what's your perspective?
There are so many things people can do on an individual level to contribute, and they all matter, whether that's changing your fossil fuel consumption or changing your diet or your contribution to the waste stream. But it's important to remember that the biggest opportunities for change are at the biggest levels. And that means governments and industries and corporations have the biggest opportunities to change the trajectory of the warming we're experiencing now.
Thank you, Peter, and a thanks to all of our guests for sharing their perspectives with us today. So, extreme weather is making climate an increasingly urgent topic of conversation in halls of power, in boardrooms, in research labs, and yes, at our dinner tables. So what can we expect, and what are we going to do about it? Thank you to our guests for helping us better understand the challenges and the scale of response that may be required of all of us. And thank you for joining us as we continue talking about things that matter with people who care.